another 30 seconds and then get started. All right, why don't we get started and people will, I'm sure, continue to join us for a bit. My name is Jerry Bonavia, and I'm the Executive Director of WAVE Educational Fund. As most, if not all of you know, we work on gun violence prevention here in the state of Wisconsin. Really excited about this program today and so happy that all of you could join us. We'll be talking about One Nation Under Guns. I have to say, I've worked on gun violence prevention for more than 30 years. I loved this book. I find it hard to believe that after all these years and all the work I've been doing that I learned a ton from this book. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. If you haven't read the book yet, I hope that you are inspired to do so today. So today we're going to be led by Jim Santelle, who is the Vice President of our Board of Directors. He's also a practicing attorney and the former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Wisconsin. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Jim. Thank you so much.
Jerry, thank you so much for not only organizing it, but promoting what should be, as you indicated, a very special program for all of our community. Delighted once again to have all of you joining us for this time of conversation and education, and yes, inspiration as well. I'm going to begin right away by introducing our guest of honor, and it is truly a pleasure. It's such a delight, both in terms of professional and personal background, to have Dr. Dominic Erdozain with us today. I could spend 20 minutes talking with you all about his spectacular accomplishments, both as an historian and an intellect and an academician and a teacher and author and on and on. I'm going to tell you just a few things about him so that you are intrigued enough to follow up not only on his wonderful book, yes, which we're going to spend some time talking about today, but also other things that he has authored for the benefit of our entire community. Dr. Erdozain is, as I said, he's an intellectual historian, and he has some very special interests in the origins of modernity and democracy. He has not only a very impressive and studied academic background with degrees from St. Peter's College at Oxford, Trinity College in Cambridge, got his PhD from Trinity College in Cambridge in 2003, has done postgraduate certificate of academic practice work also at King's College in London. He has, in addition to that, been a lecturer in the history of Christianity at King's College and done many other things in the academic world, writing, teaching, instructing on the focuses of his professional work. I want to highlight many of the things that he has done, but I'm going to limit it to just a few. He, in addition to his many articles, he has also written 3 books. His first one is called The Problem of Pleasure, Sport, Recreation, and the Crisis of Victorian Religion. A second book, The Soul of Doubt, The Religious Roots of Unbelief from Luther to Marx. And again, the book that brings us together today, One Nation Under Guns, How Gun Culture Distorts Our History and Threatens Our Democracy. Dr. Erdozain is not only, as I said, an academician, but a commentator on the things that animate us in our community today, including as late as just the past several days, making comments for all of our consumption about recent Supreme Court cases and the bump stock case of just last week. I suspect we'll get to all of that and more. We are delighted, Dr. Erdozain, to have you with us today. Welcome to WAVE, welcome to Wisconsin and beyond, and all of us who are going to enjoy so much your comments and your remarks with us today.
Thank you very much. Very kind introduction, even if you did kind of reveal my age along the way. It's funny, you write a book like this, you get a lot of hostile commentary and correspondence. And obviously this is one of the nicer responses I've had. But, you know, one day I'm getting flayed on Twitter and all this abuse coming in. And finally, what seems like a nice message comes in and says, congratulations, you deserve a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And that's the kind of the nature of the discourse. Now, as you probably gather, I'm British, and I'm a walking illustration of Samuel Johnson's adage that travel invariably narrows the mind. You travel abroad and you have this culture shock. And in my case, it was the culture shock of gun violence that sort of drove me back to the sources to think, well, is this America? Is the gun synonymous with America? And really, I concluded that it's not, and that what we're living through is a strange aberration. And really what I'm trying to do in the book is to put some distance between gun culture as we now experience or suffer it, and the best and the intentions of the American political tradition. And I think that sense of being maladjusted is really important for all of us. Sometimes we feel alienated to a point of despair by what's going on politically, socially in our communities. But I think if we can harness the sense of unease, I mean, I'm thinking of MLK, here we are in Atlanta, and he talks about the necessity of maladjustment. And for me, Jim was very kind with the introduction, but really I left a faculty job to move here as a trailing spouse in corporate speak. And that was a strange thing, not just a loss of identity, but also a sense that if you're not writing lectures, if you're not writing articles for journals, what are you doing? There has to be a sort of intrinsic value. And it upped the stakes a little bit, and made me much more determined to sort of address fundamental questions. But as I ease into the gun question, the other quote I just wanted to share was, so I'm just reading a book on Gandhi at the moment, and it was a great dialogue when he was in London in 1930, in deep negotiations with the British government, and a journalist asked him what he thought of European civilization, and he said, I think it would be a great idea. And I feel like people like Gandhi, MLK, and E.P. Thompson, who's a historian that's inspired me in his work on anti-nuclear activism, is to show that feeling of alienation and the pain we sometimes have through our personal suffering, whether it's through COVID or gun violence or whatever it may be, can actually be illuminating if we allow it to be. Thompson wrote this fantastic lecture, which was meant to be a BBC lecture on Beyond the Cold War. And he basically just says, what we've been told to think of as permanent and fixed and wired into our national identity is actually false. It's a construct. And he has this ability just to unseat the orthodoxy that we kind of cringe under and say, look, there are more powerful forces in history, the power of the people, the power of culture. And he sort of, a technical term we use in the profession of history is you historicize something. That is, you take it and understand its sources. And by doing that, you in a sense, cut it down to size a little bit. Here's what Thompson says. We're historians because we know that the past is not dead, inert and confining, but is strong with energies that can be brought once again to our side. And this idea that we've naturalized or normalized nuclear weapons and we don't have to. This is a strange thing. So that's the kind of mentality I went in with. My friends, conservative as well as, or liberal as well as conservative, would say, look, guns are America. It's just what it is. And I found that even as recently as the 1990s, or even the first decade of this century, there was deep suspicion about permitless carry, about sort of weapons we've come to live with. Stand your ground laws, 21st century. They did not exist at the state level before this century. And I felt that we'd all just been taken in. We'd been almost overawed by something which is so recent and therefore so contestable. What really got me excited was going back to the founders and seeing that it's not just a question of piecing together the Second Amendment. There's some great legal studies out there that show where the modern courts have got it wrong, that explain what a well-regulated militia is and how it's nothing to do with individual gun rights. But what they didn't do, for my money, was understand the concept of freedom, of civil liberty as protection from the dangers of our fellow citizens, of our peers, just as much as the tyranny of kings. And that it's a cultured thing. Liberty is a garden, not a forest. It's a place where we feel safe because we are disarmed. Even Alexander Hamilton, ironically, spoke very eloquently on this theme, saying that the nature of civil liberty is the transfer of the sword, the transfer of power from the sanguinary agency of the sword, sanguinary is blood, to the mild and salutary influence of the courts. That's something that Abraham Lincoln would call the political religion of America in his famous Lyceum address of 1838, that there's a sort of reverence for the law. John Locke, most famously, what is government for? It's to restrain the violence and partiality of men. Now, I don't apologize for using the masculine pronouns there, because it is a deeply masculine problem, this problem of aggression and egoism. I think of Abigail Adams writing to her husband saying, remember the ladies, remember all men would be tyrants if they could. So I found in the founders this extraordinary, this democratic theory of liberty, of tyranny rather. Anyone could be a tyrant. And therefore, although humans are good and created equal, and there's a sort of immense, tremendous of natural dignity, there is also a danger. This is where modern democracy differs from classical republicanism, which had this great sense that people could be virtuous. If you read the Federalist Papers, and they are absolutely absorbing, maybe not all of them, but there is this, Hamilton and Madison both chide the ancient republics for their naive faith in virtue. The most famous one, of course, is Madison saying, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. But we're not. None of us is an angel. This is where I really struggled with the doctrines of the law-abiding citizen and the good guys being armed against the bad guys. It's like this way of thinking is totally alien to the founders. Even Jefferson, who is the most optimistic about human nature, says, the fantastical idea that men could be governed by virtue was never mine. He talks about the legislature. The will of the people as embodied in the legislature is like the natural reason, the natural law of society. So where conscience fails, the political process picks up the slack. Where this is very foreign to the modern idea of us as these kind of imperious, infallible, flawless citizens who can just walk around armed. That is just not the way they thought. So that got me very excited, because I felt that there was a sort of a theory of human nature that could be recovered. And I find it very attractive because there is this sense of dignity, John Milton and all these great sort of founders of the democratic tradition have this fierce protest against hierarchy, the idea that anyone is born to govern and to rule and to exert dominion over other humans. Every life is sacred. But also, if we have free will, we also are free to fail and to fall. And we need to develop political institutions and systems that are capable of dealing with that. Okay, quickly. A well-regulated militia. A well-regulated militia is an embodiment of the social contract. So what happens is you surrender some of your natural liberty and your capacity to hurt people to the state, and you pool your resources and you share in this common enterprise of security. And that's what a well-regulated militia is. It's nothing to do with individual gun rights. And it's important because it stops the state having a professional army, what they called a standing army, which would lead America down the way of Europe, of imperialism, of conquest. I see the Second Amendment as an anti-war measure because those who demanded it were mostly concerned about the emergence of a professional army. The Constitution, as it was drafted, seemed to concentrate too much power in the federal government. It allowed for professional armies for 2 years and a navy and the conscription of the militia into a centralized unit, and everyone's panicked about that. They are not panicking about the loss of individual gun rights. So in a sense, I was excited to see that the well-regulated militia is just not this arcane institution. It's an expression of the shared, collective, collaborative model of democracy. Hamilton, again, is prophetic because he warns against a Bill of Rights. He says, look, who among us could say what something as obvious as liberty of the press is going to mean in 50 years' time? Just be careful before you try to roll liberty into a sentence. You'll create a rod for your own back. You'll be a hostage to fortune. And kind of that's what happens. The militia becomes obsolete really by the 1812 war when it just disperses and the British regulars come in. I don't say that with any kind of patriotic pride. And even Jefferson realizes that a well-regulated militia is a weak reed on which to rest the security of the state. And really, people don't want to leave their homes and families to fight. Well-regulated militia involves everybody, and most people don't want to fight. Alexis de Tocqueville praises the demilitarized United States when he comes to the US. He loves the fact that people are not, they're more interested in business. The Brits thought that well, not the Brits, but actually the French, because it was Napoleon that called us a nation of shopkeepers. But often there's a sort of old world snobbery about commerce, but de Tocqueville loved it. It's much better if people are making money than fighting and killing each other. So where does it unravel? Number one, slavery. Slavery is the wrecking ball because it embodies the very tyranny that the modern state is supposed to tame, control. Solomon Northup, if you could read one book, 12 Years a Slave, you might have seen the movie with Brad Pitt and others. It brilliantly captures the brutality of the slave culture. And Solomon Northup says, the violence here is praised. It's not tolerated. It's actually praised. And acts that would bring instant and condign punishment in the North are smiled upon in the South. Charles Sumner says the same thing. Sarah and Angeline Grimke and Dwight Weldon, they produce their big book, Slavery as It Is, catalog endless incidents of gun violence and advertisements for runaway slaves, just with casual references to these brutal injuries inflicted by weapons. And then Charles Dickens, touring the US in 1842, is horrified by the violence of Southern congressmen in Washington, their willingness to pull pistols and Bowie knives on each other. There's a brilliant book on this by the way, Joanne Freeman's book, Field of Blood, which talks about the violence in Congress in the antebellum period. It's nearly all from slave owners. And only in the mid-1850s do Northerners start to arm themselves for self-defense, and then you get this escalation. So the second great source, sadly, is patriotism, it's the Civil War, it's even anti-slavery agitation. This sense that there's a higher law now after the federal support for slavery and the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. You get people like Frederick Douglass and Sumner himself. Sumner was the fiercest critic of Southern gun culture. And then in the context of Bleeding Kansas in the 1850s, he's like, well, if you can't beat them, join them. You know, we're going to have to retaliate in kind. Sadly, the Civil War really does legitimize a kind of liberationist, heroic counter-tyranny that spreads guns. Samuel Colt, there's a brilliant book that discusses, I could share the link for some of these things later, but discusses the financial woes of gun makers in the antebellum period. And Samuel Colt saying, who's going to buy these weapons after the subjugation of the Seminoles in Florida in the 1840s? And the revolver had only just been invented in 1835. He's saying, who's going to buy this gun? We're not going to have a market. You know, poor old Samuel Colt can't sell his weapon because Americans don't want to buy it. The Civil War will create that mass market for it. Okay, then we get the frontier, which is highly mythologized, but we get the spread west, the continuation of the Civil War in many ways, and a kind of romanticized patriotism we associate with people like Theodore Roosevelt, which valorizes individual gun rights in a way, or gun use in a way that is not very historical, but it funnels into the National Rifle Association. Painful fact, that comes from the North, not the South. That's another legacy of the Civil War. So the book has a bit of, a lot of discussion of how this kind of white, nativist patriotism really takes the gun as its symbol and its enforcer, and the NRA, in an often explicitly racist terms, manages to offset or parry the effect, the intentions of people like FDR and those who would regulate handguns in the 20th century. Machine guns, as we know, are sort of taxed out of existence in 1934, but really that's the only successful federal gun control, perhaps. I'll accelerate through this to the Supreme Court discussion. So what happens is that the 60s is the big debate. The 60s is the closest America comes to substantial gun control, but it fails partly through racial anxiety and fear after the riots in several American cities. And at this point, even someone like Richard Nixon is in favor of a total ban of handguns. He calls guns an abomination. He says there's no reason for anyone to have a handgun in his home. And I think the interesting thing about this period is there is this ecological understanding of guns that a gun in a home isn't necessarily going to stay there. It's not like selling someone a cup of coffee. It could be kept for a long time. And there was a much more sophisticated understanding of the environmental problem of guns, and that family members die. And there was a famous criminologist who said the bedroom is the most dangerous place in America because people are killing mainly their wives and family members. But that all ends with Reagan. So you have a conservative narrative in favor of gun control that just disappears with Reagan. Two of Nixon's attorney generals are in favor of a total ban on handguns, including a report that was published by the Justice Department in 1973. Reagan flips it on its head, and what happens is that the gun becomes this symbol of Americanism, a symbol of, it's a front on which the Cold War is being fought. You have the evil empire abroad, and you have the evil empire at home, the empire of crime, the idea that it's only bad guys who are misusing guns, and you have to arm the good guys, a militarization of culture. And from this emerges, well, Reagan honors the NRA. He speaks at the NRA's annual conference in 1983, and he starts to make judicial appointments. The NRA starts to finance studies into the Second Amendment. In the 1950s and 60s, there are lobbyists who are sent away by the NRA to research the Second Amendment. They come back and they say, there's nothing good doing here. It's a state right. It's not a personal right. Get over it. And this is picked apart in the 80s and 90s. Gary Wills, some of you may know, wrote a scathing critique of this new, what he called it, wacky scholarship, which basically uses dictionaries and sort of pieces together the meaning by just playing around with words. And he's mocking. This is 1995. By 2008, these blunders and these sleights of hand have become federal law. The Heller decision takes up a whole chapter in the book. I call it death by dictionary because although Antonin Scalia, who authors this opinion, calls it originalism, we never really get the full sentence of the Second Amendment about a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. What we get is it's turned upside down, so he takes the last bit first, and then he breaks up the words and says, what's an arm? Well, it's a gun. What's to keep? It's to own. What's to bear? It's to carry. So rather than saying that's military language, firmly ensconced in a military discourse and the fear of standing armies, he creates a kind of hybrid, modern, anachronistic meaning. By anachronistic, I just mean it's of a completely different date. The language is a big giveaway for historians. He's using phrases like law-abiding citizens. That's modern gun culture language. It's not 18th century Republican theory language. And he constructs this monster of an anachronism and then pulls through the 19th century literature saying, look, all 19th century authorities agree with us. And they don't. What's his prize example that perfectly captures the meaning of the Second Amendment? It's a ruling in this state, the slave state of Georgia, from a notorious white supremacist called Joseph Henry Lumpkin, who authorized the use of dogs in chasing runaway slaves, or property as he called them. And in other rulings said that African Americans or freedmen, whether they're slaves or free, would not be able to bear arms because of the curse of Ham. You know, he's using these biblical curses. These are not people who should be defining law for anybody. This was an outlier even within the values of the South, where most Southern rulings were actually in favor of the military interpretation. This thinking should not be defining our jurisprudence now, in my opinion. Okay, I've run over the time. I just want to say a little bit about what we can do, because we've had the Cargill decision that Jim referred to, where bump stock bans, which even Trump's administration is calling for a bump stock ban. We've had the massive extension of the Heller decision in Bruin in 2022, which extends this right to own a handgun outside the home, which is radical and totally foreign to 20th century jurisprudence. So we've got the legal problem. So I just want to say very quickly where I see sort of grounds for hope. For the time being, you think about the civil rights movement. They didn't sit down and say, look, what does the law allow us to do? What's realistic? They said, what can we imagine? What are the promises of liberty as embodied in our Constitution and our traditions and our theoretical traditions? This King's idea of the Constitution as a promissory note. It's time to cash it. So we can look back and we can imagine a future in which guns are not front and center. I struggle with the notion of common sense, and there's columnists who say we're destined to be surrounded by a sea of guns. We have to talk about gun safety, not gun control. Think that we need to think more boldly. And I like the idea of an aesthetic approach. I mean, I started off talking about nuclear weapons. Dorothy Day is one of my heroes, the Catholic peace activist and journalist, and she refused to cooperate with nuclear fallout drills in New York. And Eleanor Roosevelt, who is a friend of hers, said, well, why would you not do that? It's for your safety. And she says, well, the moment I do that, I've acknowledged the presence of nuclear weapons, and I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to dignify them. Oscar Wilde, random quote, that just popped up while I was researching this. As long as war is regarded as wicked, he says, it will always have its fascination, its appeal. When it's looked upon as vulgar, it will cease to be popular. So I feel like popular culture can play a role. My favorite movie, my favorite Western, probably not my favorite all-time movie, is The Big Country with Gregory Peck. Has anyone seen The Big Country? It's a masterful deconstruction of the sort of redemptive violence that you see in most movies. And he's this sort of like a higher masculinity. You want to be Gregory Peck, not Charlton Heston, who's the sort of the antagonist in the movie. I think there are possibilities there. Simone Weil, the brilliant sort of mid-20th century mystical writer, she says force derives 3/4 of its strength from its prestige in culture. It's a cultural thing. We bow our heads to it. So while this stuff is depressing, she called the Iliad a picture of loveliness, the poem, the Iliad. Why? Because it just unmasked force. There was no romance to it. There's no redemptive violence. She found it lovely because it told the truth. So while some of this history is grim, it does perform this role of unmasking the gun. And I think we just need better ideals. We need people like MLK. We need people like Gregory Peck, who incidentally did campaign for gun control. And I'll just finish with a quotation from Frederick Douglass. Yesterday was Juneteenth, and he was making people laugh, sort of mocking the kind of Christianity that supports slavery. And the curse of Ham, which I've already mentioned, the idea that the Africans were cursed from the time of Noah. And he's joking about it. He said it's not profane to joke about these things because really, by helping you to laugh at it, actually breaks the charm. We've been held in awe by this thing, and we need to break the charm. So I don't want to ridicule people. I don't want to ridicule gun owners, but we have to find some ways of unseating and decentering the gun in our culture. Okay, I'm sorry, I went over my timing, but look forward to the questions.
Not at all. And all of us, I think, could appreciate how wonderful it would be to be in one of your classes. I did not previously say that Dr. Erdozain is right now a visiting scholar at Emory University. So we need to enroll to get more of this. Absolutely fantastic. And I would say, before I launch into some questions and also solicit some from our members and our participants here, that Doctor, you've done an outstanding job of giving us the broad sense of some of the great movements in your book. There is an awful lot more inside that gives even more depth and more specificity to what you have said. And that's the reason why I also commend everyone to read this outstanding piece of scholarly work on our history. I want to go back and ask you to pull apart a little bit more, a couple of things that I know are very contemporary as well. You mentioned the NRA, and obviously an awful lot of what our discussion is about in America focuses on their work. And you as an historian, and it's in the book, you also commented about this, the extent to which the NRA even today plays itself as a civil rights organization, and that an organization that is out there for human interests. Comment on the extent to which history supports that and your sense of reaction to that sort of posturing by the NRA in America today.
Yeah, I think the idea of it being America's oldest civil rights organization is a stretch, because particularly that phrase itself is synonymous with the struggle in the South for racial justice and freedom. So I think that in itself is a stretch. The beauty of history is that, I don't want to come in and throw stones at the NRA as it is now, and it's had these financial woes and this corruption and some vicious rhetoric. I think the power of history to explain what it is to go back to origins and see that it is explicitly nativist in the 20s. By that, I mean it is opposing immigration. It's saying that America's problem is the mixed blood. It's not the white Anglo-Saxon America, which is a character who's close to God in being slow to anger. I mean, this language of this biblical language of purity that is used in the pages of the NRA, and then talking about foreigners as mongrels, of talking about the foreign user of the gun, talking about African Americans as being inherently unstable, unsuited to hold a gun. Copies of Birth of the Nation, the racist epic that took the country by storm in 1915, really just showed blacks to be incapable of holding a gun or using one safely, and that it's the stately, strong, righteous whites that hold them. That narrative goes all the way through. I can't quote the material from the 60s, but there are statements in its full ugliness, but there are statements saying, really, in the end, these riots in Detroit and in Newark and in Watts may serve to protect our precious right to bear arms, because they show the ugly side of this unstable community. Ronald Reagan is calling it the protest of the mad dogs against the people. I mean, that dehumanizing language, and that has been the DNA of the early NRA, which just gets smarter in the modern period and encrypts the racism in dog whistles. But it's been always a minority, but it was only a few 100,000 at the beginning of the 60s. I think it was 300,000 or so, and by the end of the 60s, it was almost 1 million. I don't know whether it is now 4 or 5 million, but it's always spoken for a small minority, or claimed it's represented a small minority, but claimed to speak for the nation, and that's never been the case.
And you have spent a good deal of time, not only today, but also in your book, talking about the myths of America. You're talking about the myths of sort of the law-abiding citizen, the good guy with a gun, all of that. And once again, commend very much your excellent writing about that history. My question focuses then upon the use by Antonin Scalia, which you have made reference to already in the Heller decision, and going back and looking at history as you have done, and coming to this dramatically different result about what the Second Amendment means. I want to both commend once again the reading of this book to all of you, because it is in many ways, to my mind, the most compelling refutation of what Antonin Scalia said in Heller, that indeed this language does give all Americans inside the Constitution a right to possession and use of an individual firearm, and the use in the home. Bruin obviously extends that. I'm wondering, Professor, if you might spend a bit more time beyond even what you have done, giving us some insights into the ways in which that opinion in Heller is premised upon sand, and that your scholarship, again, which is in this book, and it's all this is the response, if you will, to Heller, and that your scholarship shows the extent to which the premise of this decision that changed America for the first time, 2008, first time we articulated this very odd notion of what the Second Amendment means, it is simply wrong.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could talk about that a bit more.
Certainly. I mean, history sometimes, feels like it's a descent into minutiae, but I think the most important thing we do is to understand the way ideas are embedded and involved within a culture, and how they unfold in dynamic interaction. So for me, this language of social contract, which sounds dry, is quite exciting, because it's an image of it's like of reciprocity, that we have shared obligations, and that we're all in it together, we're sharing, we're pooling our resources, and it's part of a community. I think that what pained me most with the Heller decision was, while claiming to be originalist, it discarded all this context and the political philosophy in which these words were embedded. So there is almost a comical absurdity to the oral debate. I haven't read many of these oral debates of the court, but if you read the oral debate for Heller, it has sort of head in your hand moments, because it's not just Scalia. Scalia spends the whole time saying that, militia, it's not regulated, or at least it's not massively regulated. He wants to sort of demilitia the militia. He accepts that language is there, but he thinks that the militia is just this pool of armed people that spontaneously arises. Patrick Charles, who goes into more detail than me, William G. Merkel, I recommend his work. They all show that the militia doesn't spontaneously come together in a revolution. It's been drilling and training for years. When you're in a militia, you're under authority. It's an army. Read Blackstone. William Blackstone's the great jurist. He says that you can be court-martialed if you disobey orders in the militia. And if you think that sounds harsh, this is the security we have. It's the price we have for not having a professional army, which will turn us into the despotisms of Europe if we're not careful. George Washington, he wrote scathingly about the drafts, as he called them, and they're conscripted because they're just not professional soldiers. And he found that almost like a quarter of them absconded from their posts, and he had some of them court-martialed. I won't go into the details of that, but it's a brutal thing. It's an army. It's a state army. And for Scalia to construct a meaning by dismissing that was appalling to my mind. But also Anthony Kennedy in the same discussion keeps asking questions to the council, guns to defend themselves against grizzlies and outlaws. Grizzlies, he keeps talking about grizzlies. He has this cartoonish image of the founders living on the frontier, which they're not living on, most of them, and having to arm themselves against wild animals and outlaws. And very politely, the council keeps saying, no, that was not the discourse. And you read, and I discussed this maybe for a paragraph. That's all my editor allowed me. I could have talked all day about the oral debate, but it's frightening that then becomes the basis. There are so many mistakes there. I'll share this story because the day I took citizenship, I happened to be looking at this 1842 ruling in Huntley, the state in North Carolina, that says, never may the day come when in our peaceful state, people are carrying guns around as part of their manly accoutrements. And it just says the absolute opposite of Heller. So I Google this case, or I didn't Google it, I searched my computer. Find that it's there in the Heller ruling, but with a misspelling and the absolute opposite conclusion. So I think this is very odd. It's misspelled. So I Google the misspelling and the exact page references, and it takes me straight to the NRA website and an amicus brief submitted by georgiacarry.org. Now, that could just be a remarkable coincidence, but it seems to me that there's a copying and pasting going on here. I spoke to another historian about this, and he says, if you think that's bad, read Bruin. It's all been drawn together from the gun lobby. And we saw a New York Times piece 2 days ago with similar examples. This is fake history. That's no exaggeration. So sorry, I could talk all day about this, but that individual discourse just is not there for the founders. It's not part of the Republican political philosophy and what is often referred to as the American political creed, trial by jury, protections against standing armies, habeas corpus. There's a distinct package, and individual gun rights are not part of them.
Doctor, if only we could have had you on the Supreme Court to write a compelling dissent in 2008 to articulate all of that, to tell Justice Scalia and the majority how wrong they are. Again, compelling language and a compelling narrative here. We're talking about Supreme Court cases. Everyone who's joining us today recognizes that there are at least 2 gun cases pending, and again, one of those recently decided. Wondering if you could, we talked briefly about Bruin, of course, it extends Heller into the public domain. And we've got this recent case just last week, Cargill, in which the Supreme Court, again, over some very vigorous dissents, finds that that bump stocks, the regulation issued by ATF under an executive order, as you said, by President Trump, cannot stand, and that the statute is inconsistent with the decision by ATF to forbid these items. Thoughts about that in the wake of all of your wonderful historical research and analysis, and a sense of where we're going, even in that context, when we examine specific kinds of this case, equipment and a thing that converts a gun into a machine gun in America.
Yeah, well, I wrote a piece on CNN talking about some of the technicalities and the misuse or manipulation of language in Cargill, but I think where I have some authority is on the political philosophy and the understanding of what the modern state is designed to be. I think about John Adams saying that the modern state has to have gears within gears, wheels within wheels, that you have to parry and baffle and slow down the passions of men that are dangerous, that are reckless, that the genetic code of the modern state is to control violence. is to prevent violence. And what we have in this modern philosophy, you know, in Bruin, you have this military language, the right to keep and bear arms, applied to the law-abiding citizen. And that's putting two things together that should never have been together. Because, you know, I've quoted Locke, it's to restrain the violence and the passions of men that we have government. So on that level, it's an absurdity. In Cargill, we saw really a semantic argument prevail over an argument about safety and what these weapons are doing and how they operate. That it's almost like, you know, an LED light. You know, an incandescent light is steady. That's your machine gun. An LED light appears to be steady, but it's actually flickering very, very fast. That's the kind of argument that Justice Thomas used to say that it behaves as if it's being operated by a lightning-fingered virtuoso, but actually the trigger's moving, therefore I'm not going to call it a machine gun. And then again, he's quoting dictionaries to say what a trigger is. We know what a trigger is. So I think there's a kind of bad faith element here and the kind of smoke and mirrors element. So that's a disaster. I don't think, we talked about this last night, I don't think it's likely that they're going to uphold a domestic abuser's right to own a gun in Rahimi. But I think that really would be the reductio ad absurdum, given what we're saying about the modern state. You know, Tom Paine, let me one more quote from the founders. You know, a government that cannot protect the people is no government at all, he says. He's talking about the violence in the Boston Massacre, in which 5 people died. 5 people. A Boston Massacre happens every hour in America, in raw numerical terms. We're not protecting our people, our children in schools. So let's think about that side of government rather than being lost in these technicalities.
Absolutely. And we're going to open it up in just a few moments or so to questions from our audience here and our membership as well. You appropriately today and in your writings have identified that even though a great many challenges out there, there are movements forward. You've talked about some of the cultural strategies out there already. Wondering if you could spend a minute or two more talking about the future and about what we can do at a time when we have a Supreme Court making these kinds of decisions and a Supreme Court that relies upon incredibly, not just bad, but inaccurate history to justify some of those decisions. Where do we go from here, Professor?
Ooh, now that's the tough one for a historian. Something we were talking about briefly earlier was to what extent we can harness, this is more of a general approach first, harness patriotism. You know, one of the best bits of feedback I've had was that someone said, all my life I've been made to feel unpatriotic for having this view of guns. And what you've shown is that I can be American. In fact, it's more American to believe in the regulation of power, the regulation of lethal force, and the protection of people than these unlimited rights. So while I'm very ambivalent about patriotism and its connection with war and its connection with a sort of arrogance that can bring us, and I speak for my own country as much as America there, I wonder whether we can harness forms of patriotism. One of the other nice bits of feedback I had, and I don't read any of the online reviews, I just try for the sake of my sanity not to, even positive ones, just I can't do it. But some say, look, my conclusion where I threw out some of these points about Simone Weil and Voltaire saying, you know, once something's become ridiculous, it can never more be dangerous, whether that's true or not. When someone said, look, it's really affected what I watch, the sort of shows I watch and how I see there isn't innocence in these romanticized roles of guns. I think maybe there's a possibility there. That's why I was talking about Gregory Peck earlier. This is, again, too abstract. Practical things. I found in my friendships, I've become a bit liberated by being a bit bolder to say I've got friends who own Glock handguns. I've got friends who own assault weapons. And I have found myself quoting people like the CEO of Dick's Sporting Goods when they announced that they weren't going to be stocking assault weapons. He said, and it was privately to the board, I think, but it was quoted saying that we don't want to be part of that story anymore. And what I've been saying to my gun owning friends is that whether you like it or not, you are part of that story. You know, when none of us is isolated, even if you see it purely as an economic thing. Imagine if people stopped buying guns in Atlanta when that kid who committed the mass shooting 3 years ago, if there weren't any stores for him to go and buy it from. It happens on the day. Imagine if the law-abiding citizens stopped buying them and they weren't so, so universally available. So what I'm trying to say to my gun owning friends is, you might be perfect. You may have never lost your temper, but you are part of it. You're connected. There are not many people I know well enough to express it in those terms, but I feel like I've almost sort of become an abolitionist in the sense that, there's been too much talking around it. And I just want to be frank and say that we're all connected. And, FDR says this as governor of New York, just do it for the community. So I think being authentic in our personal conversations and outlook and being consistent and could serve to I think demystify the gun is one word I sometimes use, but just unseat the gun and it's kind of its iconic legitimacy, perhaps.
Outstanding commission going forward. I want to, before we do in fact invite other questions, which I suspect are many, and also focused on the good and thoughtful words you provided us already, I want to make another encouragement to everybody to read this book. And again, I benefit not at all from it, but I want to tell you two things about this book that Dr. Erdozain is sufficiently humble not to talk about. One is that it's incredibly accessible, and that is, as he has spoken with us today, this is I don't want to say easy in the literal sense of the word, but this is an easy and accessible read, and it is the kind of academic work that is understandable and approachable, and I found myself, again, quite literally not being able to put it down. The second thing I will say about it, which those of you who know me will not be surprised that I would highlight this, is that to the extent that you are concerned at all about the legitimacy of the things that Dr. Erdozain writes about here, there are 60 pages of footnotes at the end of this book. And some of the footnotes in it themselves are gems of history and of insight into what he's saying in the principal text, but also commend this book because it is, unlike what our Supreme Court has said, it is the foundational piece, understanding our history, where we've been in the past, where we are today, and again, as Doctor, you've just said today, where we might be going in the future. So wonderful, wonderful read. I know my colleagues inside and outside of WAVE feel the same way. Let us open this up. Heidi and Amber, if there are individuals who have let us know that there are questions that they would like to ask the doctor about, we'd be able to do that. I have more questions, but want to make certain that everyone has an opportunity to pick a doctor's brain about all these wonderful things that he has studied and written about so very compellingly.
We have not had any questions in the
All right.
chat,
All right.
but this would be, oh, we have one right here. Nancy Jones asks, she says she appreciates the reference to redemptive violence. What do you see as productive counter narratives?
Very good.
Yeah, I think that there's so many examples that come to me from reading Gandhi and all these other authors, but there here in Atlanta, you read the account of Martin Luther King in Montgomery, of his home being bombed and a crowd forming and bringing their guns and wanting to exact vengeance for this attack. And he gives a speech and just says, that's not who we are. That's not what we do. And to read that it's there in Taylor Branch's great trilogy, History of the Civil Rights Movement. It's there in a shorter version in Stride Towards Freedom. But that narrative will just give you chills. The power in which he diffuses the violence. The same with Andrew Young in Selma, when he talks people off a ledge when they want to fight back at the police. He says, what kind of weapons have you got? What have they got? What's this going to achieve for us? What's this going to do? So our history is full of these examples. Gandhi disarming the British Empire in India. So there is the exciting, in Richard Gregg's book, The Power of Nonviolence, he says we've got to recapture the word wonder. Nonviolence has got a wonder to it when you see it in action and its effect of diffusing aggression. On the negative side, we have got to see the effect. Slavery ended in the British Empire because of the images and the journalism and the showing of the sheer ugliness of it. We don't see that here. We have a sanitized account, and it's totally understandable that the victims of gun violence do not want their family members and the images to be shown. It's redacted. I feel, there was a peace activist in the First World War, I forget her name, but she came out of prison and became prison reform. And she said no judge should be able to sentence anybody to a custodial sentence in prison without having spent at least a week inside to see what it is. I feel no legislator should be able to legislate on gun violence without touring a trauma unit, without seeing effects. So I think we have got to see a more brutal reality and get out of our romance.
Excellent. Very good. Good. Your very last sentence in your book goes to that point. You talk about Martin Luther King and his home being bombed. You say, a man whose house was bombed can do it. That is changing the course of American history. So can we. I think that's what you're articulating here once again. Right?
Yeah, and I think that was something that inspired me, because he said he felt more free. Because the thing is, if you walk around with a gun, or if you have one in your home, you're in charge, you're responsible. And you live under the burden of that anxiety, which you've been told to believe is free. You know, this is the great thing about, someone like Gandhi, is that he critiques the myth of individuality. You really are not gods. You think you are, but you're not up to the job, the task. A friend of mine did a study in North Carolina at Duke on concealed weapon trainers, and it's all incidentally out of date, and he's worried about publication because of the fact that they were training people to meet the requirements for concealed carry, and now you don't need the requirements, it's permitless. But one of these Christian concealed weapon instructors was explaining proudly that he doesn't even go to his mailbox. My mailbox, just down the 60 feet away or something. He won't even pick up his mail without strapping on his gun first. It's like, that is not freedom. I think we need to have a bolder and a more exciting idea of freedom than that is based on fear. And that's where I think the masculinity thing could be an argument. It's not really very manly to be sort of, looking over your shoulder like this and worried. I mean, I think we just need models of people who have faced these challenges. Someone like Gabby Giffords is a good one. And they've transcended it.
Very good.
Oh, sorry. Someone's mentioned Jim Atwood. Could I speak to, are there any other questions?
Please. Absolutely.
I haven't read the whole thing. I just saw the name pop up. I love Jim Atwood. And I love his deconstruction of the notion of the idolatry, the false trust. And he was someone who, and I quoted him in the introduction to the book, and of the pseudo freedom, the absurdity of thinking where we can control others when we can't even control ourselves. But he also had this other book that he published shortly before he died, Collateral, thinking about the fallout. We talk too much about statistics and the numbers. We've had lockdown days here. We've had my doctor's surgery was the site of a mass shooting last year, and only one person died. But the trauma from that event has radiated out, and I think we need to talk more honestly and robustly. I didn't see the full comment about Jim Atwood, but people like that are just are a light, and I hope that I'm excited to think that his legacy really has been carried forward.
Doctor, there's also a comment from one of our good colleagues and friends, Scott, who also talks about the religious aspect of this. And I happen to know that you are right now working on another book. I believe it's called Arming Jesus, God, and Guns in America. The comment from Scott, and actually the question is, what has been your experience in talking with faith leaders, and what participation do they have as a part of this debate?
Yeah, this has not been great for me, and I think I'm going to put that one on hold. I mean, it's a really important subject, but I found that after the shooting in Atlanta, no one wanted to talk about it. People have... Christianity in the South is both highly religious and highly secular in its affirmation of a secular, kind of quite a brutal, individualistic ethic. And the worst letters, I've been going through Molly Ivans' correspondence. Molly Ivans was an iconic sort of provocative journalist of the 1980s and 90s, and died in 2006, I think. But I had the privilege of going through some of her correspondence, and it's amazing how much of the nasty stuff on guns comes from Christians. And one of them summarizes my chapter on the myth of the law-abiding citizen, says, look, Christians don't need gun control. Franklin Graham, son of the great evangelist, Billy Graham, says, God has already done a background check on us. We're okay. Mm-hmm. And so Christianity really is at the center of it. But for my publisher doesn't want me to go into the religious stuff just yet. But maybe I should, because I feel that it goes a long way back to a sort of theology that's not based on works, it's based on faith, and it's being in the club by faith. If you're saved by faith alone, the ethical side is suppressed to some extent. And there is this idea of being chosen. You see this in these letters to Molly Ivans. You know, we're special, we're different. You know, I'm a Christian, I own that, but I don't think I was sort of saved from the worst of my passions or the potential for violence. And I think in a way the Christian side is so emotive for me that I'm not sure I can handle it just yet. But it's a big problem, and I think that you know the adage about or the teaching about you live by the sword, you die by it is one that we need to recognize, and I think it carries over into the secular realm as well.
Very good. We have just a couple of minutes left. Any other questions, even from WAVE staff, that you'd like to pose to the doctor while we are benefiting so much from his insights and his perspectives here today?
Could I just jump in? So just while
yes, I was going to actually invite you to make some final commissioning.
The armor of light. So because I hadn't read through the full question about the Christian side, there's a really good documentary called The Armor of Light with Lucy McBath and Rob Schenck, an evangelical minister, addressing this, and it's a really good starting point. I think that he just makes the point, if you're going to be pro-life, you should be pro-life, and that should include critiquing guns. So I think there is great work to be done. I haven't had a great success myself in talking to evangelicals in Atlanta.
Well, we encourage you very much to keep on that good work, because the things that you say, the insights you bring, not only about our history, but our contemporary life here, are extraordinarily compelling. I want to give you an opportunity. You and I have chatted before about your work generally, your commission that you're giving us for the future. Any other? Linda, do you have something you wanted to ask? If not, Linda, we'll also take a comment or so on the chat as well. But Doctor, wanted to just follow up and as we begin to conclude here, give you the opportunity to address anything that we haven't specifically talked about, and there is a lot, but also things that we should take away from today, insights that I think you think are especially important in here in mid-June of 2024 in our nation.
Well, I'll just say thank you, and that it's a privilege for me as a theorist. It's easy for me to say, from the point of view of scholarship, talk about these big ideas and these inspiring people. And often activists will say to me, it's not as simple as that, and it's hard. I want to thank you for the work you do, and for hearing me out on this rather sort of theoretical sort of jamboree discussion, and just say that the reason the historians I admire most, like E.P. Thompson, are social historians, is that they understand the real force of history does come from below, and that leaders are often just trying to play catch up with the grassroots movements. And so I really want you to believe in the power and significance of what you're doing, and to think that, we write books thinking we're going to change the world, but, knowing that we might just change the way one or two people think, but that's enough. That is a change. And I'm really grateful to be in dialogue with you. And I know that the tide is turning. A big moment for me was hearing Emma Gonzalez just coming out and making that speech after Parkland saying, we call BS. We call BS. I just felt a weight coming off my shoulders then to hear that. And that almost was a code that I've been using in my own research. It's not a phrase that I use in writing. But I know that there's momentum, and I know that the dots are beginning to join up. So this has been one of the most invigorating discussions I've had. So thank you so much for inviting me, and I know that change is going to come.
Very good. The book is One Nation Under Guns by Dominic Erdozain. It is available. All of us plainly commend it tremendously as you go forward. I want to thank all of the participants today in our program. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. I know that, like me, you are inspired by the words of our professor here today. And I want to also, of course, thank our great guest, Dominic Erdozain, for spending this time with us. If you happen to find yourself in Atlanta and I'm going to guess that this outstanding journalist, historian and journalist, journaling a history of these days, and academician and scholar would more than be welcome, would welcome you into the campus here to continue that conversation. And we look forward to more of that with you, Dr. Directly. We thank you so very much for your time and your insights today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. Please do come visit. If anyone wants a book and the cost an issue, I've got spare ones here. I'll send you one. I'd be delighted. So, or if you know someone who'd like one, let me know. I've got spare ones. So anyway, I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Wonderful. Doctor, thank you so much. More information as always about WAVE, our mission, our purpose, our goals, as the doctor articulated them today, and as we have as well in the chat and available online. Thank you, everybody, for being a part of our discussion, and have a good week, a good weekend coming up. Take care, everyone.
Thanks. Thank you.